don't clap yet. So as you know, this is one of two opportunities for us to talk about some of the ethical, social implications of the research that you guys are about to embark on. This one will be a little bit of a more formal lecture. I'll do a lot of talking at you, unfortunately, but there will be plenty of time for questions and commentary at the end. Tomorrow, I'll be joining you for dinner, and that will be a more informal opportunity for us to have more of a conversation. So I'd like you to think while I'm going over the slides now, I'd like you to keep in the back of your mind whether there are issues that you want to discuss, you want to hear me discuss, or you want to discuss, things that you either want to pick up on from this lecture or other things that I'm not addressing in this lecture, because I'm definitely not addressing everything in this lecture. And I'll be happy, please let me know if you can, send me an email or let me know in the break after the session, and I'll be very happy to whip something up overnight and incorporate it into our session tomorrow. Okay, so the agenda for today is as follows. So first I'm going to give a brief history. I don't know why Patrick is smiling. I'm going to give a brief history of the eugenics movement, very unfunny. Then I'm going to do a non-exhaustive list of things that should keep you awake at night as you embark on this work. All right? And then finally, I'll end with some I'll call them emerging best practices for responsible conduct and communication of social science genomic research. All right. So, a brief history of the eugenics movement. It has been said that there are really two versions floating around out there of the history of the eugenics movement. And the first has been called the official version. And this is what is generally taught to new geneticists, also to bioethicists. It's certainly a version that I think I was exposed to earlier in my training. It also dominates the popular understanding, at least in the US. I should qualify that and say, in other countries, you may do a better job of educating folks than we do here. And that official version focuses on the racist aspects of the eugenics movement. It puts the large part of the blame on reactionary thinkers and politicians. It acknowledges, of course, that there were some scientists involved in the eugenics movement, but it sort of, it views those as, few and far between and relatively marginal. And really, there's a direct line from Darwin to Hitler and perhaps other exceptional figures like Trump. So there's the official version. And if that were the only version or the most accurate version, this might be a quick talk. And it might be easy to not take this history as seriously as I want to urge you all to take it. So here's the real version, and there's the source of this distinction down at the bottom. The real version, and perhaps this is why it's not often taught, is a lot harder to teach because it's complicated, it's nuanced, it doesn't fit into neat boxes. It's less reassuring, and quite frankly, it's harder to draw clear, crisp bioethical lessons from. The basic headline is that the eugenics movement involved a remarkably large and diverse membership of people. They were diverse in a lot of different attributes that I'll go over, including their political views and their policy interventions that they favored. So, a little bit of background. So again, obviously the apex of this movement was the Third Reich, and for obvious and mostly understandable reasons, that piece of the eugenic movement has come to really dominate the way we remember it, the way we understand it, etc. But there's a real danger in focusing on that because, as I said, or as I alluded to before, it's easy. I assume none of you self-identify as Nazis. It's relatively easy to sort of compartmentalize that, push it away. In fact, that was with the history of human experimentation. That was largely what scientists would say, well, we're not Nazis, these things don't apply to us, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little bit too easy and pat to do that. So the first thing to know is this wasn't just about Germany, obviously. I mean, maybe not obviously. It was really a fairly global movement. The UK, the US, these are all countries that had really robust eugenic programs. UK, US, France, Brazil, Canada, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Russia, the Soviet Union, and of course, Germany. The disciplines involved, and that's not an exhaustive list, were also diverse. Medicine, my profession, the law profession, sociology, anthropology, So many different types of people were involved in this. Even at the level of the belief in the transmission of parental traits to offspring, even there was actually some diversity. For obvious reasons, we think about eugenics as being very focused on genetic transmission. And indeed, the Anglo-Saxon strain of the eugenics movement really did focus on that. But there was this sort of interesting Lamarckian version of it that was dominant in France and Brazil, at least, where the idea was that, the parents were really transmitting to their offspring traits that they developed during their lifetime, so it was more environmental. And so neonatal rearing was at least as important as who you reproduced with to begin with. For the Anglo-Saxon, the more familiar strain of the eugenic movement that I think most of us are probably more familiar with, that focused on the so-called germplasm theory. There was this immutable germplasm that would be transmitted, and what was natural was a sort of survival of the fittest and a natural selection. And there came to be a view, and we'll turn back to this in more detail, there came to be a view that modern life, including medicine, but other modern social welfare structures, depending on what type of eugenicist you were, different aspects of modern life were really interfering with natural selection and creating what some eugenicists called unnatural selection. So that they were really kind of rescuing the so-called unfit, and that this was creating lots of social crises that really were catastrophic and imminent and needed to be addressed. So there was some demographic heterogeneity. There were plenty of women, despite the fact, as we'll see later, that the primary target of coercive interventions were women and women's bodies. There were plenty of women who were part of the eugenic movement or movements. There were also some Jewish people, obviously some anti-Semitic people, but also some Jewish people. So it's not quite as clean as we might imagine. And some of this work was funded by such foundations as the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. All right, so some basic history. You can actually trace the history of eugenics in some sense back to Plato, but most people start with Galton, and that seems good enough for us too. Of course, Galton was Darwin's cousin, and it's, he got started by just sort of observing that what he referred to as genius, which tended to be scientific genius, literary genius, other types of talents that couldn't be acquired, or so he thought, couldn't be acquired through social position or status, but must have reflected some sort of innate talent or ability. He observed that those types of talents clustered in a few families, and not coincidentally his own, among the families. I mean, just conveniently. And his goal, and this will be another common theme, and this is why it's a little bit hard to just easily dismiss the whole eugenic movement as something radically distinct from anything that could be happening today, and something that we can just sort of wholesale, carve ourselves away from. The goal was a relatively beneficial one, or a benevolent one. The goal was to improve society, and it was to say, we should increase the amount of talent and virtue, other characteristics in society. And, the means that he favored was really just encouraging these favored families, Darwin and Galton himself, and so forth and so on, encouraging those genius families to reproduce more. And then things would be even better. Our ratio, humankind's ratio of talent to less talent would be even better if we could sort of discourage the unfavored, the disfavored people from reproducing, or reproducing quite as much. And in 1883, so about 15 years after he started publishing in this vein, he officially coined the term eugenics, which he defined as the science of improving stock, not only by judicious mating, but whatever tends to give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. There was a very widespread and nearly immediate impact of Galton's work. The impact tended to be in the middle and upper middle classes, including lots of academics, lots of politicians, and many other professionals. In the US and the UK, eugenics was both this popular movement, it was also a research program. As I mentioned before, the Carnegie Foundation was heavily invested in this. They funded the Eugenic Record Office under the sociologist Charles Davenport, and they busied themselves with collecting pedigrees from the public. They had lots of interviewers who would go out and interview the public to collect these pedigrees. Eugenics became standard in biology textbooks. There were fitter families competitions at state fairs, which are, easy to kind of ridicule because they are sort of silly looking. I mean, these families showing up with like blue ribbons as if they were a breed of cows or something. It's like, best cow at the best fair or whatever. It's a little silly, but it's an example of how incredibly mainstream all of this was. And here's another connection is that there's this public health norm that begins to emerge. And the idea is that private reproductive decisions are no longer really private. They can create devastating consequences for society for generations to come. And there's this, obligation of the individual to do what's right for the collective. And that kind of thinking is not at all unique to eugenics. It is at the heart of all of public health, which is one of the reasons why public health as a field has been ethically challenging. Think about vaccinations, it's a constant tension between the individual and the collective. All right, so we started with Galton focusing on a relatively small handful of families that had really what he viewed as exceptional genius. And by the time it spreads, just a few decades later, it's become something much more than like a Mensa type club. It's become more of, the average American or the average person versus other people who came to be known as white trash and other derogatory terms. So here's where it gets interesting. This is the traditional way. This is all very blurry, but for purposes of trying to impress on you the diversity, the ideological diversity that's part of this movement, I'm nevertheless going to go ahead and make some somewhat simplistic distinctions here. So this comes from Kels, and the traditional distinction among eugenics is between what he said was a mainline versus reform. You could also say reactionary versus progressive. Okay, so again, this is sort of like the official history, probably the history that you have a little bit more familiarity with. This type of eugenics was espoused by people who are mostly conservative, but not exclusively. There was a very strong classism involved. So it's been described as a middle class activism focused upon the pauper class with a biological view of human failings. And the focus was on social ills of the time, like poverty, prostitution, unemployment, lack of education, crime, alcoholism, etc., that seemed to be increasing around this time. There was, of course, also a racism, and race in this time period meant something different than what we would normally mean. So, for example, Southern and Eastern Europeans were viewed as a different race than Northern Europeans, etc. And then there was also a nationalism in some parts of this type of eugenics. That is, there would be concern that there was at once a global crisis. The gene pool was degenerating. But at the same time, we were sort of in this race to the bottom, and each nation was in danger of losing compared to other nations. And we had to, each nation had to really take it upon themselves to sort of clean up their own individual gene pool. So it's a pretty nasty combination of classism, racism, and nationalism. But here's the thing, and again, if we could just dismiss all that and say that's what eugenics was, we could kind of go home. Kind of, maybe, a little bit, but it's not all it was. So there's this whole other aspect of eugenics that is referred to as either reform eugenics or progressive eugenics. This is typically left of center folks. In the US, it was the Progressive Party, the Fabian Socialists in the UK, the Social Democrats in Norway and Canada, and so forth and so on. The father of the Danish welfare state was an adherent. They did often reject the mainline eugenicist assumptions. For example, they would point out that in a country like the US, where there isn't equality of opportunity, you can't just look at the phenotype of success, if you will, and then infer genotype from that and use that to decide, who should be encouraged to breed or discouraged to breed. But they thought that that was totally possible to do and really good idea if we would just have socialism. So we would just enact socialism, and then it would be scientifically valid to infer genotype from phenotype where you have true equality of opportunity. And often there was, a justification of eugenic policies that looked to the cost that could be saved thereby, and it was those costs that would be reabsorbed into the social democratic state, that is for this cradle to grave social security program. So in a way, eugenics was a way of saving money from this wing of eugenics. There was something called the Eugenicist Manifesto from 1939 that many scientists signed, and they really said, the overall goal is to engineer reproduction in order to optimize health, and then intelligence, and then pro-sociality. Those were the traits that they wanted to increase through selective breeding, if you will. And someday, it was really a sort of an enhancement kind of view. Someday, everyone will look at Galton's genius and say, that's my birthright. So we have this obligation to enhance the human race. All that said, left of center, but most people, some of them explicitly disavowed racism and sexism. Some of them disavowed it while still, expressing it. Some presumably, some arguably didn't express it, but, most exhibited some form of racism and classism. And in any case, regardless of what their own views were, the fact is that the eugenic targets, even of reform or progressive eugenics, typically ended up focusing on people who were stigmatized, already stigmatized, or otherwise vulnerable. So who were the most, what groups were the most likely to resist eugenics? Mostly the political right. Obviously not everyone on the political right. There was plenty of pro-eugenics on the right, but most of the opposition came from the right, especially the Catholic Church. As you might imagine, any control of fertility was something that the Catholic Church was not going to support. Okay. So, diverse policy commitment. So what was eugenics? What did it, sound in? How did it end up manifesting? Well, there isn't a simple answer to that. So there's positive eugenics, in scare quotes, which basically means, encouraging whoever it is you think is most fit, just encouraging them to make more babies, basically. And you could do that through advice giving. You could set up, marriage advice clinics were a thing. You could incentivize them economically by providing family allowances to make it easier for them to have more kids. And then there were some wacky ideas like mass insemination of women with the sperm of a few distinguished men. So you can imagine, the so-called sperm, the Nobel sperm bank, which is a real thing. Well, the idea here was, it was that kind of crossed with Handmaid's Tale. So it was a range of policy ideas. That one never came to fruition. The other ones were actually real. That the mass insemination thing was just a pipe dream, if you will. I didn't plan that. Negative eugenics. So here, the idea is you're curbing or attempting to curb the fertility of the people you deem to be less fit. And again, there's a range of techniques here. So sexual segregation was a very popular one. This found its form in anti-miscegenation laws. Jews and Aryans couldn't marry or breed, blacks and whites, so forth and so on. Also anti-immigration laws, much easier to keep people apart if you don't let them into your country to begin with. Then we go from that, which is sort of ugly enough, to involuntary sterilization, which was really huge. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people, mostly women, but also men, involuntarily sterilized by the state in several countries. And then, of course, in Germany, it proceeds to euthanasia and ultimately murder, of course. So eugenicists were typically opposed to birth control, largely because the people who had access to birth control at that time were people that they thought were the most fit. And so this was like the wrong direction. This is not the way we want to be going. We want those people to have more babies. And so they actually thought that birth control was this sort of scourge and contributing to degeneration. But then there were feminist eugenicists who supported reproductive control as a means of improving the gene pool. Many accepted state coercion, but others really focused on voluntary practices. Really, anyone who was focused on positive eugenics was almost by definition focused on voluntary practices. Galton himself actually wanted to make eugenics a civic religion. That didn't happen. So despite all of this heterogeneity, what are some common themes across the eugenics movement? So the first, as I've mentioned before, is there was this prevalent, widespread fear of catastrophic degeneration of humankind. And prior to Galton, the primary explanation for this had been environmental. So this is around the Industrial Revolution, and people thought, people are healthy and fit in the country, and these people are moving into the cities, and crime is flourishing, all these bad things are happening. And it was some sort of environmental story. But then we get the germplasm theory, and it sort of flips, and we kind of forget about the environmental piece of things, and we focus almost exclusively on genes. And so we take these massive, complex social problems like crime and unemployment and illiteracy and so forth and so on, and we reduce it to genes, by the way, without the science, of course, to back that up at all the time. And then there was a second kind of strain, or a different sort of strain of eugenic explanation, which focused on racial purity. And here, the oddity, it was really racial purity. It wasn't just that certain races, quote unquote, were superior to others. It was also that mixing any two races was thought to be bad in some sense, such that if you had, mixed race offspring, they were thought to be less fit, less pure, less fit than either of their parents, regardless of what the two races of the parents were. So that's belief one. Belief two, obviously a belief in the strong heritability of behaviors. And at the time, really based on very, very little evidence. So Davenport, the sociologist, he had a list of traits that he thought were genetic, really almost entirely genetic. Pauperism was one, also love of the sea, and he assumed that was sex-linked because he had observed, astutely that all sea captains were male. So for many eugenicists, though, intelligence was really the key trait. It was like, I want to say the uber trait, and I guess I will say that, it's the uber trait. It really played an outsized role in many different strands of eugenics. For example, other traits were thought to flow through that, such as morality. The idea was if you lack sufficient intelligence, you're not bright enough to distinguish right from wrong. And finally, the goals. Broad goals they shared in common, even if they disagreed on the means. So again, at the broadest level, the shared goal was a concern for human betterment through selection. And in particular, the idea was to improve the overall quality of the gene pool, whether through positive or negative eugenics. Given the time period, there was no genetic engineering, there was no CRISPR, Cas9, there was no amniocentesis, there was none of that. So it's really reproduction, it's really human breeding was of necessity the only tool, the only policy lever in the eugenicist toolkit. And so that entailed this view, as I mentioned before, that reproduction is not a private choice. It's really an act that has social consequences, and there's some duty to think about the consequences of reproduction vis-a-vis the collective. And germ plasma, in turn, is seen as a social resource, and its use should be governed by the public good. Okay, so four philosophers, Buchanan, Brock, Daniels, and Wickler, wrote a book called Chance to Choice, From Chance to Choice, Genetics and Justice. Originally published in 2000, it's been reprinted since then, and they go over a lot of this history of eugenics, and the book is mostly about, how do we know like what specifically was wrong about eugenics, especially considering it had good goals in a lot of cases. So how do we, and it shares goals with things like public health, and I think we don't really want to say, well, we're not going to stop vaccinating. So how do we tease apart what was really wrong with eugenics so that we know what not to repeat and so forth and so on, and their focus is largely on reproduction and reproductive technologies. But I digress. They anticipate that some readers will think this eugenic history that they begin their book with is going to be just really an academic exercise, and it's not going to be relevant today. And so they are very skeptical of that attitude, and they ask the reader to ask herself two questions. So today, is genetic determinism, and they don't add in the general public, but I will, because I think scientifically, in the scientific community, it is much less than it was in Galton's time, or in the decades that followed Galton. At least in the general public, is genetic determinism significantly less prevalent today than it was during the heyday of the eugenics movement? And two, is there today less of an invested interest in avoiding the conclusion that social problems are significantly rooted in our institutions and structures? In other words, is it a lot less easy today to sort of point to biology than to complex entrenched structures? And they answer both of those questions, no. Genetic determinism is still a thing today, it's still a threat, and there's still a lot of interests in avoiding the conclusion that a lot of our social ills have social roots. Okay, so where does that leave us, or really where does that leave you as you think about getting into social science genomic research? So I want to suggest that the rules for conducting this type of research should be different than the rules for conducting garden variety research, namely research that doesn't pose the kind of social risks that we've just gone over. And the first thing I think you have to the first shift you have to make in your thinking about conducting and communicating this research is, traditionally you engage in research, you publish it, you disseminate it, and you kind of walk away. And if people want to use it in some way, that's sort of on them, so forth and so on. What I want to suggest is that this requires ethically a much more proactive approach to conducting and communicating this research. And so it's just not going to be, I think, good enough to fall back on the typical scientific practices. One analogy that might or might not be helpful is dual-use research of concern. This is typically, this is a governmental policy that's typically focused on things like bioweapons, things like recreating strains of smallpox and so forth and so on. But it's also been applied to big data and just modeling things, like modeling threats to the milk supply, for example. And the basic idea is that in the case of research where the research poses significant social risks, there has to be a balance between the traditional freedoms of academic or scientific freedom, academic freedom, so forth and so on, the freedom to just ask scientific questions on the one hand, and trying to mitigate those risks on the other hand. So here is the promised non-exhaustive list of things that should keep you up at night. You may or may not be familiar or used to asking yourself, what are the potential benefits of my research, depending on what research you do, and do they justify the risks? To some extent, that's part of an IRB application. But I think we have to think pretty hard about that in this context. So here's a couple of broad answers to that question with respect to behavioral genetics broadly. The first one comes from the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which is a very prominent UK bioethics think tank. And they did a whole report on behavioral genetics. And they concluded that research in behavioral genetics has the potential to advance our understanding of human behavior, and therefore it can be justified. However, those who fund the research should fund research of a very high caliber, not just any research, so maybe a higher threshold for that. People should be transparent about their funding practices, should be aware of the potential for the abuse and misinterpretation of results. I'm going to go a little bit further and suggest you should be proactive in trying to prevent misinterpretations. and misuses, especially misinterpretations, but at a minimum, yes, you should be aware of them. And pay special care, pay careful attention to public concerns. Here's another answer. A prominent US bioethics think tank called the Hastings Center convened an expert workshop group, and they were thinking specifically about the genetics of intelligence and that type of research. And this is from the introduction, summarizing the results of this workshop. There was a range of views, and the editors say, we heard profound concern that the research would further disadvantage people who are already disadvantaged, yet no arguments that it should come to a halt. Okay. The only thing I will add to that is that you might want to consider whether there are particular phenotypes where the scientific benefits of studying those phenotypes is not worth the risks. You might also think about particular analyses. Comparing different ancestral groups, for example, might be different than comparing individuals within an ancestral group. These have different social implications. All right, next terror to keep you up at night. What about the people whose data you're actually using? So these people come from biobanks. It's UK Biobank, 23andMe, a variety of different sources. So how would they feel about having their data used for a variety of different research purposes? So I'm going to show you a snapshot of unpublished data of mine. To tee up the problem is that the data from these biobanks is usually collected under what's called either broad consent or blanket consent. Blanket consent is, pretty much anything goes. There are some ethicists who say that's not real consent at all. It's not meaningful consent because it's a blank check. How can you consent to, a blank check? That's not my view. However, you do worry about what the average biobank participant's mental model is of the type of research that might be conducted with their data. And we'll come back to that in a minute. For broad consent is kind of like what it sounds like. It's not study specific. You can't have biobanks that operate with study specific consent because you'd have to go back and recontact and reconsent hundreds of thousands of people or more for every different GWAS you did. It's completely out of the question. And so instead, what's typically done is it's broad consent. And so there are broad limitations to the acceptable secondary uses. Often those broad consents focus on health. They'll say something like, human health and disease. So the data that I'm going to show you comes from the MyCode Community Health Initiative, which is the Geisinger's biobank. It's about 240,000 people in it, and it is broad consent, and the consent form references repeatedly human health and disease, etc. So the question there becomes, what do biobank participants mean by health, and what do scientists mean by health? Scientists who are familiar with the social determinants of health know that there are important connections between things like income and education and health. So it is relevant, but it's not clear to me that the average person is aware of the social determinants of health and would have in their mind, yes, I consent to let you study my data to study health. They might be thinking of, cancer and heart disease. So that's a potential problem. So we conducted 10 focus groups, which I'm not going to discuss, and then we used those to develop a survey. And so about 3,300 people, not that exciting of a response rate, unfortunately. We do have a very diverse sample, so we did some stratified sampling, and we also oversampled for racial and ethnic diversity. And I'll mention this is joint work with my Geisinger colleagues listed there. So I'm just going to show you a snapshot. Maybe I'll present more data tomorrow night over dinner. We gave them 35 phenotypes from, on the one hand, things like heart disease and kidney disease, on the other two, non-heterosexual behavior and depression and anxiety and personality preferences and educational attainment, sort of a whole range of different types of phenotypes, most of which, except for the kind of manipulation checks around heart disease and so forth, would be of interest to social science genetics researchers. And we asked them at baseline, before we told them anything about why and when we would be wanting to do this, we said, would this be appropriate based on what you understand about, what you consented to do? Would this be appropriate to use to study with your data? Would it be inappropriate, or are you unsure? And the phenotypes here are all the phenotypes of the 35 where at least 10% of the sample said they were inappropriate. Okay, so this is, I don't know how many that is, but 35 minus however many that is. So most of those phenotypes, most people were fine with.
Just a little question. So for the questions regarding those topics, was the questionnaire suggesting that the research would be done behind the walls of Geisinger, or they would be put on public databases even if they were de-identified?
So the assumptions that we asked them to make were that the data is already collected, because the people we surveyed are people who are already in our biobank. So we have EHR data and we have biobank data, we have sequence data. And so we asked them to assume that there was nothing more that they had to do. They didn't have to give us any more information. We could just do it with what we already had. And we also asked them to assume that it was all de-identified and so that there were not privacy issues. We didn't explicitly talk about data sharing or posting it on a public repository or anything, but I think that was sort of implied. It was really about, implicitly, what would it be appropriate for Geisinger researchers or other researchers who access this database to do with it. Okay, and so of all the people who said that a particular phenotype would be inappropriate to study, we then asked them why. The first thing we did is we gave them a free response, and we said, tell us in a sentence or two why. So we let them tell us whatever reason it was, and we qualitatively coded that. Then we asked them the same question, but we populated it with multiple choice answers that were based on the focus group that we had done. And I'm not going to present the qualitative data, but what I'll tell you is that, and we also, so we gave them basically 3 buckets of reasons. The first one is that phenotype isn't related to health. That's kind of one of the things that animated this project was, boy, we as researchers have broad conceptions of what is health related, what phenotypes are health related, but maybe the average person doesn't. And so that was one possible answer. The other answer was, what does this have to do? What does educational attainment have to do with genetics? What does my personality have to, what does depression or addiction have to do with genetics? That was another possible answer. The third answer, of course, was, eugenics. Did you not pay attention to the first part of the lecture? The third part is like, this could be, insurance discrimination, all manner of things, bad things could happen, and I don't want to be complicit in that. And then there was other. So the people who chose other, and the question was, what's the most important reason? You might have all of those reasons. What was the most important reason that you said inappropriate? And the people saying other was very small. And the qualitative coding suggests these are the 3 main buckets. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the breakdown. So what we see is that highlighted in yellow is the dominant reason. And for all but 2 phenotypes, the dominant reason is that the belief is these phenotypes are unrelated to genetics. And so it would be inappropriate in the sense of, and we heard this in focus groups, people would say, this is wasteful. This is a waste of time. It's a waste of money. And by the way, that was our third assumption. We did say, we're not doing this exercise as a sort of resource allocation exercise. And so assume, this is really actually cheap. Once we've collected all the data, it's actually cheap to just crunch numbers in a GWAS. That, is hard to communicate to people, and it's hard to get them to believe us that it's not that costly once we've collected all the data. But we tried to get them to assume that we could study all the things, and so none of this would crowd out cancer research, for example. Nevertheless, lots of people said it's just not related to genetics. So that's lesson 1. Is that there's a pretty profound gap between what scientists in this room and the emerging consensus is about the heritability of most all human traits on the one hand, and the public's understanding of what is genetic on the other hand. Yes?
Is that at odds with the view that genetic determinism and kind of the assumptions of eugenics are still widespread?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think you can still be a genetic determinist with respect to the phenotypes that you think are influenced by genes. But in the focus groups, it was interesting. People really had discrete buckets. Something was either genetic or it was environmental, or it was a third thing, which we would consider to be, there was a third thing, which is like free choice or free will, or it's your own fault. People had a hard time with the idea that there could be joint contributions of genes and environment to outcomes.
It is surprising that things like intelligence and income, which you think might partly reflect hard work or something. Galton was assuming those things were genetic and.
Couldn't the issue be that they're thinking about they're just using the word genetics to mean something different? Like, I don't think it's unreasonable to say these things are unrelated to genetics if you're kind of not viewing it through the Jenksian lens. You see what I mean? So, like, maybe in their minds, if a gene influences an outcome through some really complicated pathway, it's not really, it's not really genetic anymore.
You also need to take the product of the. These are of the people who rated inappropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for intelligence, right, you're 11 times 43, like,
right.
It's only 4%.
Yeah, good point. Yes.
So this is like the survey question options for why this is inappropriate, right?
Yes.
So what if there's another survey question about like what's the percentage of genetic influence you think that's relevant to this traits? Probably people would give like pretty small estimates instead of saying it's totally covered.
Yeah, so it would be interesting to have like a slider scale survey question where we say, genetics on one end, environment on the other end, go ahead and slide for all the phenotypes. Yeah, so what we're going to be doing a bunch of follow-up work, but yeah. Yes?
Any idea about the aggregate statistics of the demographics of the respondents?
From memory, so again, I might present more of this data. Here, I just wanted to give you a snapshot, partly because it's unpublished and this is recorded. So I can give you that tomorrow. But racial ethnic diversity is about 17%. Like I said, we oversampled. Racial ethnic diversity is not our strong suit in central Pennsylvania, but we did oversample, so we got 17%. We stratified by age, so we have beautiful age diversity. We have beautiful socioeconomic diversity, educational attainment, income. We have a ton of that diversity. So this is not your typical urban setting, lots of higher educated, et cetera. Really quite good diversity. So lesson one, right, there's this sort of gap of understanding between the public and scientists with respect to the heritability of certain traits and the futility or lack thereof of studying the genetic component of them. Lesson two is, in the third column over there, sexual orientation and race ethnicity. These are ones where the main reason that people were opposed to them has to do not with the view that it's not genetic, but rather with the view that there are serious ethical issues, risks of discrimination, prejudice, unfair treatment, and so forth and so on, that it would really be inappropriate to study those. Okay. One more slide from this study. So this is aggregated across all topics. We wanted to see whether white people and non-white people, which I'll define in a second, had different predominant reasons for objecting to things. So by non-white, unfortunately, I'm lumping people who self-report as either Hispanic and or at least one non-white racial category. And I have to lump because I just don't have the sample size to do a fine-grained distinction there. And what you see is, for everybody, the dominant reason remains it's unrelated to genetics, but you do have a statistically significant difference where the non-white participants, respondents, are more likely to object on what's called ethics grounds than are white respondents, which is not especially surprising. If anything, it's maybe surprising that it's only that small. Okay, back to our list of nightmares. All right, so we've talked about the people who are directly in the data sets that you guys are all analyzing. But genetics being what it is, you can infer from other people, whether it's relatives or larger groups things about them from what people who are consented study. Now, one of you asked me a question, and the question was something like, if you participate in genetic research, do you have to get the consent of your relatives? And the short answer is absolutely not, no. I'm not saying that's a good thing, I'm just saying no. I don't know of a single genetic study. The only exception I can think of is for identical twins. For identical twins, for obvious reasons, that's a little bit of an exceptional situation, and even there, it's really, what I've seen is, you should really discuss with your identical twin before giving us your DNA, right? Even there, I think it's rare at best to require consent. And that's sort of interesting. Consent is very individualistic. Genetic information is very much not. Okay, so what about other people who aren't directly in a data set? So here's a good, well-known example of this. So the Havasupai Tribe is a tribe that lives at the bottom of Grand Canyon, and researchers from the University of Arizona and Arizona State approached them. Well, if I'm remembering correctly, there was sort of a mutual, some of the members of the tribe approached them. There were epidemic levels of diabetes in the tribe at the time, and they were interested to see, is there a genetic component? Can science help us? And so they were motivated by a desire to try to do something about the epidemic of diabetes in the tribe. So that was the oral discussion. These are all, let me just put like alleged throughout, because this gets into lawsuits. Let me just say alleged. So allegedly, the oral discussions were all around diabetes. There was a written consent form that said the purpose of giving them samples was to study causes of behavioral/medical disorders. Again, those are those broad terms where a meeting of the minds is awfully unlikely to happen. And allegedly, what happened with the direct researchers, also with postdocs, other labs, as the data set got spread around, the tribe ends up being studied for things like schizophrenia, consanguinity, and population migration. And you can probably see immediately why the first two phenotypes might be sensitive, might be things that the tribe might not want to have studied. Population migration is sensitive because the tribe has a particular origin story that has them originating in the Grand Canyon, not elsewhere on a different continent. And so that was very upsetting for them. And obviously, the conclusions about the tribe implicated something about not just the 400 or so people who actually donated blood, but the entire tribe. Lawsuit, it settled. They ended up having to return and destroy samples. They had to redact publications. It was really a big deal. And Native American perspectives on appropriate uses of their sample continues to this day to be a very important thing. It's something that the NIH All of Us research project, which you've probably heard of, is paying a lot of attention to, in part because of this story. Okay. Some other nightmares. Is the communication or application of my work getting ahead of the science or the evidence? It's never good to hype your research, but it's really especially not good to do it with respect to this type of research. Certainly one problem with eugenics is, boy, the policies just leaped way. Whatever you want to say about the ethics of the policies, they just had no business suggesting any of those policies based on the science that was available at the time. Will my work be misinterpreted? Will my work be misused? Will it create and lead to stigma? Will people feel differently about themselves in a bad way because of my work? Will other people feel differently about them because of my work? Could my work help animate various forms of discrimination, whether in employment, education, healthcare, different types of insurance, reproduction or adoption policies even? Will my work exacerbate existing or create new inequalities? This could happen in one of two ways. So negatively, it could exacerbate inequalities by contributing to stigma or discrimination. Positively, even if you think that the research turns out to be actually really fruitful and beneficial, then the problem might actually become you're a victim of your own success in the sense that, or other people are victims of your success, rather, in the sense that, for example, maybe it leads to some sort of technology or service that only the wealthy have access to, and or it's only useful in people of European ancestries, because most of our genomic data comes from people of European ancestries. So in medical genetics, that is a big problem. Our polygenic scores, there are controversies around whether it's ready for clinical prime time, cancer polygenic scores, cardiovascular, type 2 diabetes, so forth and so on. But leaving that aside, if it is ready for prime time, it's a little bit of a justice issue. It's not a little bit, it's a big justice issue, because you already have health disparities between people of European ancestries and other people in our health system. And if you have a tool that actually is useful in stratifying risk and anticipating risk, it sort of feels like you're going to be leaving people without European ancestries behind. So those are things to think about. What can I do to minimize the risks of my work? Okay, so final segment. What the SSGAC has done, one of the things that they have done is write these FAQs, really since the very first EA1 that it produced, and increasingly elaborate FAQs. And if you haven't been to the website, there it is. Everything is right there. It's freely available. We try to, link to it. We should do a better job, actually, of linking to it in the papers themselves, at least in the acknowledgement sections. We try to reference them on Twitter. Anytime we're discussing it, we definitely disseminate it to journalists, so forth and so on. And so here's an example. This is from EA2. This is just sort of an overview. You can see there's an entire section on the social implications of the study. I asked you to read the one for EA3, so I won't belabor that. The FAQs has gotten some nice shout outs and some appreciation. So Nature had an editorial that said, scientists would do well to follow the example of SSGAC. The Hastings Center report, again, in that same workshop report they did, they praised that and said, an essay explained in plain English how the study was conducted and what it did and did not find. Not really an essay, but it's okay. So other emerging best practices. What else can you do besides FAQs? Insist on very high standards for study design. Which is really the whole GWAS community is already doing that, right? Like you already have to have replication sets generally. We don't want a repeat of the candidate gene scenario. Share data commensurate with ability to with privacy issues, of course, but allow people to replicate your results so that there's trust. There's skepticism, right? There's skepticism that traits are as behavioral as some people think. Sharing the data, allowing other people to reproduce your analyses is critical. Again, rather than hyping results, maybe err on the side of actually emphasizing the limitations. That's unorthodox and not what most of us are trained to do. But it's important in this context. Active communications of what results do mean, but also what they don't mean. Try to anticipate those misunderstandings and shoot them down. No, I'm not saying this, I'm not saying that. See, the FAQs has a lot of examples of that. We say predict. Here's what we mean by predict. It's a term of art that scientists use. It doesn't mean we're fortune tellers. That's not, so don't hear predict in the way that you might as a layperson. Seeking out responsible science journalists. This can be tricky with embargoes, but to the extent possible, it's great to see who does good, responsible coverage, because there are journalists who will, want to hype. They will want to hype your results along with you, or despite you're not doing it. So try to seek out those journalists who do a careful, nuanced job, who report in a really balanced way, and try to encourage them to cover your work and cover it first so that it sets the tone for the rest of the coverage, so that you don't get a stream of clickbait stories on your article. Eric Perrins, who's at the Hastings Center, recently suggested one thing that would be useful to do is what he calls rapid responses to bad science. The idea here is, you're going to be producing these GWAS, you're going to be producing polygenic scores. other people are definitely going to use those results in their own work. And sometimes they're not going to use it in ways that are even scientifically valid, right? Like they're going to try to apply a PRS out of sample to someone, to a group of non-European ancestries or whatever. You might be tempted to just let that go, right? Here, I think again, the rules are a little bit different. So I think the best thing to do is generally going to be to respond. And it's important to respond at the same level that the bad science is at. So if it's in a mid-tier journal, you don't need to go to the New York Times, right? Because the problem is that could actually elevate the bad science and disseminate it further. You don't want that. But certainly you should think about whether it's appropriate to respond in the same journal. Write a response, write a letter to the editor, ask for a correction, etc. So take responsibility for how your own work is being used or misused. And then in conclusion, I'll just say, Eric Perrins and I and several other people have a grant pending before a couple of different funders to pull together a working group of ethicists and sociologists and critical race scholars, et cetera, and also social scientists interested in and doing social science genomic research to try to think through how can this work be done responsibly, what concrete actions can we take to mitigate the risks. So watch this space. We hope to have more concrete suggestions for you going forward. Okay, that's all I have. Yes.
Thank you so much for that. I was actually I just wanted to elaborate a little bit more on sort of the points that you brought up at the end, because this is definitely interesting in terms of even in like sort of genomics research and not just in the social sciences. In terms of, there is a little bit of this thing of, how do you communicate your science clearly and make it accessible without overhyping, that you sort of address, right? In the sense that if you could imagine that if we put some kind of emphasis that people putting out potentially sensitive work would have to proactively come out with some kind of an outreach that does a better job, that would also risk, like you said, highlighting and hyping that, because it places a sense of self-importance on that work. So is there a formalized way you think that could actually carry out that process?
So that's interesting. I can say I don't know of any reaction that we've ever gotten that has suggested that the FAQs are like self-indulgent or no, I know you're not saying that, but I mean you're right. Like to some extent, I mean I guess one strategy is to just publish your thing and then just tiptoe away and then that's it, right? I mean, it's always a matter of trying to predict what the response is going to be, right? So you have to have these FAQs, they are major endeavors and they have to be done really in advance and they have to be ready to go during the embargo period so that they can be distributed to journalists. And so you're always trying to just guess at what the reaction is going to be. And so the risk, if you don't have an FAQ, I mean, the risk is that it blows up and journalists are interested. And then you're caught off guard, you don't have anything. So that's the risk of not doing anything. And, I think the way to do, I mean, for our FAQs, especially our early FAQs, like EA1, where what was like 2% or 3% of the variant, I mean, we were able to say non-hypey things like, the policy implications are really, this is just basic science research. Nobody should be out like reconstructing, pedagogies based on this GWAS. So we were able to simultaneously say, read our FAQs, and also there's nothing to see here in the sense of this isn't like a New York Times, you know what I mean? I admit that gets more difficult. The larger sample sizes you have, the more variants you explain, the more there are meaningful implications. I still think on net, it's just better to be as honest as you can about what you think the implications are.
So would that mean the possibility of co-publishing, like essentially, or having a link to a website difference potentially being either you going and reapproaching the media and kind of having a formalized way that maybe for-profit journals won't want to publish your kind of FAQs, but you could at least have a link to something that.
Yeah, I think it's worth, I mean, journals should share researchers' interest in not having people misunderstand, misuse, misinterpret, none of that, right? I mean, they should share, because it doesn't make them look good either. And so frankly, I think there could be more done to work with editors and say, most everything is online now. Are we running out of room online? Can we not publish the FAQs as part of the SI, for example? Or is it like a separate appendix or something? I mean, honestly, that really should be possible. You should be able to link that, you know, in the acknowledgments or somewhere. You know, so I get no one is going to include the FAQs in the method section or something, but I don't see why it couldn't be and shouldn't be included there, in addition to being disseminated. Because we do find people who know about the paper and don't know about the FAQs. And it would be great to close that gap so that it's almost impossible to encounter the paper without simultaneously encountering the FAQ. Yeah.
Related question about Twitter. So, how much do you think scientists discussing these things all the time on Twitter, constantly, even without referring to a specific piece of research, is hyping unnecessary, like it's getting unnecessary attention from the public and forcing the public to actually take a view on things? Because I mean, you see it all every day. So on Twitter, every day some behavior geneticist is discussing something related to this.
Well, yeah. So I guess my first response is like, might seem snarky, but I mean it honestly. Who's paying attention to science Twitter besides science Twitter, right? I mean, but seriously, I mean, I'm not. I mean, does the media? There are some journalists who do focus on genetics and social science genetics, and they're absolutely on Twitter monitoring these things, and they cover that. But they're going to cover this stuff anyway. I'm not sure the general public is paying that much attention to science
There are
Twitter.
a couple of figures that people, like a lot of people from the general public follow.
Okay.
And those are the figures that constantly discuss these things. And I mean, every day when I go on Twitter, I see some discussion about something like related to ethics and behavior genetics.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure that helps.
Is it being transparent or is it hyping? I mean,
Hyping, I think.
it's real. Well, hyping. If it's truly hyping, if it's overselling the promise or the accuracy or whatever else of science, it's bad regardless of the medium, in my view.
Making it a topic of this constant discussions, I would say. Like, so if you have just published a paper, for example, and if there's a discussion about that, I understand the point. I'm talking about constantly talking about this all the time on Twitter without even actually relating to a certain new result or anything like that.
Well, maybe we can talk offline about a particular example or person that you have in mind that might make it easier for me. No, I know. I mean, I'm trying to, you know, I'm trying to analyze a particular fact pattern, and I'm not quite sure exactly what. You know, I think I'm worried about an impulse to just kind of be quiet about stuff. So, I mean, it's natural for someone whose area of research is this to be talking a lot about it on Twitter, because any researcher is going to talk about their area of research on Twitter pretty much, right? So I don't know, unless you have something in mind that I'm not quite grokking, where they are, like I said, like they're truly hyping the results, not just by the frequency with which they mention it, which just seems like scientists being scientists. Well, I mean, I'm not sure being especially quiet about it is necessarily a good goal to have. I mean, I think we need to find a way of ultimately of bringing the public along with us, and not doing this sort of quasi-secretly, and then surprise, we've explained all the variants.
Like more like, do you think that Twitter is the right platform for scientists to be discussing this?
I mean, Twitter is not the right platform for almost anything. No, it's not. I mean, if the question is Twitter the best place? No, it's not the best place to disseminate or to have nuanced conversations or to explain very complicated science to non-scientists. No. On the other hand, the fact is conversations do happen on Twitter, and they're not likely to stop anytime super soon. And so I do think there are opportunities, or there are times or contexts where actually scientists really do need to jump in and correct the record. I mean, Amy Harmon has talked poignantly about people, on Twitter and other social media who are dealing with, having exchanges with basically like white supremacists who are mischaracterizing the science and using it to try to support, racist positions. And she talked about this one particular person who was just like, I'm not qualified. I don't have the scientific chops to be able to, I know they're wrong, but I can't quite prove it. Where are the science people? To what resources do I have to marshal against that? So I worry. It's like I take your point, but I worry about abstaining from those conversations too. I worry about the risks of that as well. Anything else?
I have a question about the informed consent. So basically, we're kind of using phenotypes against those people's will, right? Because many of them think some phenotypes are like inappropriate to study, but we use your development to study the pediatric education, something. So do you think that is kind of not ethical? And is there anything we can do to improve the consenting process?
Yeah, I think that there are probably participant-facing materials that can be presented along with broad consent that give people a better idea of the kinds of phenotypes that are studied. You can't, as I said before, you can't have study-specific consent, and you can't anticipate at time zero every phenotype you're ever going to do, that's impossible. We need broad consent. But yes, I think we can do a better job of explaining the types of phenotypes that are fair game and that are likely to be used, coupled with education about why those phenotypes are both relevant to health, where you have a health-limited broad consent, and why genetics plays a role. So there's a lot of education to do.
But do we actually educate after collecting data?
Well, I mean, the education should be during the consent process, so there's very limited, limited time for meaningful education. So, obviously, I mean, we should be teaching the social determinants of health. I have a whole list of things that I'm going to quit my day job and go be like an elementary school teacher or something. I mean, we need to be teaching about pragmatic RCTs. We need to be teaching social determinants of health. There's a whole long list of things that we're just not teaching people. Yeah.
I mean, related to, I guess so let's say that there was a consent process and we learn after the fact that the participants didn't understand what was going to be done, then is there any obligation then to like, yeah, I know that it's not convenient, but and ideally it should have happened before, but like, what do you do afterwards?
So that type of argument risks proving too much, because if you look at the empirical data on consent and what people understand about any trial or any study they're in, it's not good. Recently, for example, there was a study where they did like this Delphi process of like experts on informed consent, and they said like what are the basic things that research participants need to know? It has nothing to do with genetics, but actually no, it was biobank research. What are the basic things they need to know? And the Delphi panel said this, this, and this, and this. And they said, okay. And then they went and they tried to figure out whether people understood that, and the answer was no. They didn't understand half of it. And so they went back to the expert panel and said, okay, this is what happened. And the expert panel said, well, maybe you don't really need to know all of those things. It's a real problem. I mean, it's a real problem, and it's not limited to this. So if the rule was anytime you had evidence or reason to believe that one or more participants didn't grok every aspect of a research study, we would all close up shop. It's that bad. It's bad. I mean, the other thing I will say is that I think there's a difference between someone who objects, well, a couple different things. Okay, so first of all, I didn't show you a slide. We also asked, we said, okay, imagine that all of the phenotypes that at the end of the survey you still believe are inappropriate to study. If you had known that when you signed up, would you still have enrolled in the biobank? And then we also asked them a similar question, slightly different. If we told you that now, would you withdraw from the biobank? Because of course everyone has the right to withdraw it, so forth and so on. And about 20% of people said, I wouldn't have signed up or I would withdraw. So 80% of people were like, you're studying lots of good things. You know, I'm not really down with your studying this phenotype or these 5 phenotypes or whatever, but the other 31s are great and it's good enough. So that's number one, is the fact that people think it's inappropriate to study doesn't necessarily mean that that would change their enrollment decision. The other thing is that I do think that there's a meaningful difference between people who think it would be inappropriate to study, say, addiction, because as some of our focus group participants told us, addiction is just an individual behavior that, or depression, for example, someone said you just have to get out of bed and surround yourself with happier friends. That's what you do for addiction, for depression. So I do think that there's a meaningful difference between people who have scientific disagreements, who think, I don't think this is genetic, on the one hand, where, you know, one is tempted to say they're just wrong, factually, on the one hand, and on the other hand, people who say, I'm worried about the social risks of this, and I don't want to be complicit in contributing to those social risks. That, as a researcher, I have no special expertise in, you know, their view of complicity or whatever. So that I sort of feel like, okay, that I want to pay attention to. Whereas if their view is, you know, depression isn't related to health or depression isn't related to genes, you know, I view that differently. I think the implications, the policy implications are different.
So we still don't know whether they think it's genetic. Well, if it was genetic, they could say that it could have social implications, like if they knew it was genetic.
Well, we asked them that actually. So it's a very long survey. It's really a very long. I mean, really, this was a nightmare of a survey to analyze. We asked them to rate these questions several times throughout the survey. We took this baseline, and then we said, okay, just assume for us that all of these phenotypes are relevant to health, and that all of these phenotypes are influenced, at least to some extent, by genetics. We didn't say like it's all genetic, just there's some relevance there. Now, please tell us, of the ones that you said were inappropriate, do you want to change your mind? Do you still think they were inappropriate? And that intervention did bump up the acceptability rate by a significant percentage. There were some sticky people who were just like, no. But there were people who were like, oh, okay, fine. If you want me to assume that, then fine. We also had a consent intervention, actually, where we showed them the relevant portions of the consent form that said you are signing up to do things relevant to health and human behavior. Now that we're reminding you of what you signed up for, because I mean, it could have been years in some of these cases. They don't remember what the consent form says. Now do you want to change your mind? And like, I think 9% said they would change their mind, their rating, about at least one topic. And literally every single of the 35 phenotypes, that 9% was spread across every single phenotype but like 2 or something. So it was just totally things that are completely, like even cancer. It's like, what? That's totally related to health. Like, I mean, so nothing was spared there, and it was a very tiny. So that was another thing that people were concerned that, you know, you agreed to this thing, and there's this consent form, and you agreed to this, and there's not this meeting of the minds. We showed them the consent form, and that did not have an impact at all. The final intervention was a eugenics intervention, where we gave them a necessarily super, 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 super brief history of eugenics. And we said, look, historically, this, there's all these bad things. Now do you want to change your mind? And that had very marginal impact too. So really nothing we did. We tried to bump them, and tried to nudge them in the direction of acceptability by saying, assume it's all genetic and health related. Then we tried to nudge them the other way by saying, remember that the limits of the consent and remember eugenics. And the last two in particular had almost no effect. Yes.
Well, I think the response rate is very low, it's like 11%.
Yes.
I have no idea.
Thank you. It's very low.
They respond to the survey. Why they didn't respond, or is there a particular reason they're different?
Well, one reason is we had a heck of a time with emails. So the first batch we sent out, I think our response rate was like 5%. And it turns out we were trying to get through like Gmail's promotions filter, and we had a hard time getting an email that didn't go to spam or promotions. We made a bunch of changes. We got rid of images. I mean, like I Googled, how do you get through Gmails? I taught myself, and we made a bunch of tweaks, and then we got the response rate up to like 11%. So okay, so that's number one, but I have no idea how well that worked. I mean, obviously it worked a little bit. Maybe that's still a problem. The other thing is this biobank is sold to patients as patient participants as it's a very passive thing. I mean, we do say we can contact you for other research studies, but, I mean, and we did offer an incentive in the form of a lottery, but it was only a lottery. So it was like a $50 gift card, and there were like 6 or 8 that we were giving away. And so, we're asking people to do it for free.